Comrades, one of the things that's been a feature of politics recently in Britain, and to some degree also Scotland, has been a developing kind of movement or feeling against austerity. Now, I have to say that it's not a word I bandy about all the time, because for a lot of people it's a bit abstract, it doesn't actually mean much. But when you strip it down to its living reality, it amounts to savagery, butchery, cuts to living standards, cuts to jobs, cuts to services, cuts to the spending power of the working class majority in society. And in politics, for the SSP and the Socialists, I think it's always critical to make politics real and live and relevant to people, because otherwise you won't engage with them and you won't convince them of your alternative. And that's why I say that the bandied about expression amongst a lot of existing left activists is austerity and the campaigns and resistance to austerity. But for me, when you look at it, that includes, aside from other measures such as austerity in the form of wages being systematically driven down as a share of wealth, quite consciously, and also austerity in the sense of cuts to other public services such as the National Health Service, then one of the areas of austerity, one of the areas of cuts in every respect, is local government. It might not appear at first a very sexy subject, but it impacts the daily lives of the vast majority of the population who rely on local government services and in many cases rely on local government jobs. For example, Glasgow City Council has, at the last count, I might be dated on this, roughly 30,000 people employed. That's a huge workforce compared to anything available now, for instance, in manufacturing, as a consequence of the deindustrialisation of capitalism under Thatcher and subsequent Labour and Tory and coalition governments. So when it comes to the issue of cuts to local government, it's really important, first of all, to keep it and get into perspective the degree to which that has been slashed back, and then look at the root causes and the solutions. In terms of some bald statistics, first of all, since 2010, Westminster has passed on approximately £3 billion in cuts to local government in Scotland alone. Or to put it better way, they have handed that down as part of their overall cuts to budgets for Scotland. And then the SNP government of that period since 2010 have devolved those cuts from Westminster. They've devolved them to local authorities, for example. And this year, a budget was agreed where the SNP, because it had lost its overall majority, was reliant on the Scottish Greens. And in the budget, the Greens won some concessions, which is what they tried to emphasise, but what they didn't advertise so widely, for good reason, is that it involved 170 million further cuts to local government spending from the Scottish Government, the block grant that comes from there. And I should say from the outset that the overwhelming majority of the funding for local authorities comes from central government, in this instance Holyrood. It's at least over 75%, and actually I think it's risen beyond that. But that £170 million worth of cuts is on top of previous savagery, which I'll express in a couple of crude statistics. First of all, 40,000 council workers' jobs have disappeared in Scotland since 2010. 40,000. I mean, that's several industrial closures of the past which caused uproar. To put it a different way, £1.4 million has been slashed off local government wages bills in Scotland alone in that period of 7 years. And overall, there's been virtually a 10% cut, 9.2 to be exact, in the amount of money that the Scottish Government has allocated to local councils in that same period, from 10.5 billion to 9.5 billion. In round figures, a tenth of a cut. And those figures, incidentally, come from the Accounts Commission report, so it's not just made up by the socialist left or something. And the Fraser Allender Institute, one of those kind of economic think tanks, has predicted a further £1 billion will be cut from local government in Scotland by 3 years' time, 2020. Because when you say 2020, sometimes as a round figure seems in the far distant future. It's 3 years away or less. And I think therefore as a conclusion to all that, the cuts to jobs, the cuts to local services, the closures and mergers of schools, not for improvement education but for cost saving exercises, the way in which the workload on the remainder of the workforce has become unbearable in many cases, the increased levels of stress at work, which is across the board actually, but specifically also in local government, the way in which sickness, absence has been clamped down upon by the local authorities for the last decade or more in a quite brutal and punitive kind of fashion, instead of looking at the root causes, they're attacking people for the symptoms. And all of that and more, and the way in which, for instance, kids can no longer safely walk to primary school quite a lot of the time because the schools have been centralised through mergers as a cost-cutting device. All of that has, generally speaking, meant regression in the quality of life on the ground in Glasgow and in fact throughout every local authority in Scotland. And the point-blank choice that councillors face, no matter what party they happen to be in, I think boils down to a phrase. It's either defiance of those cuts or destruction. It's either devolved devastation on the part of the Holyrood government or defiance and defeat of the cuts being implemented by the Westminster government, not elected by the Scottish people. And unfortunately, as I've already described in a couple of figures, the path chosen, first of all by the Scottish government, but then in turn by local authority councillors, whether they be Labour or SNP or some combinations, has been to sometimes also reluctantly pass on the cuts, or in the case of some of the councillors, it's almost like they've had a birthday they want to celebrate. It's almost like they're zealous in their axe wielding on the part of services and jobs being chopped. And so that's the path that has been chosen. But one of the biggest lies that's been perpetrated since the huge lie of Tony Blair that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which justified invasion, destruction, death, mayhem and spending on war, one of the biggest lies since then is the one perpetuated before and since, not just by Tories, of course, but also by New Labour and by the SNP in reality in government, at the tops at least, is that cuts are unavoidable, that's inevitable, that there is no alternative, and that we just have to make the best of it and make the least bad cuts possible. In fact, I think one of the new developments in recent years that is quite pernicious is the way in which local authorities, when they're preparing for their annual budget setting, they engage in a bogus form of consultation with the public. They start having exercises in asking the population, both online and sometimes at public meetings. Well, that's slightly risky for them because they might face the wrath of an extremely frustrated public, fed up with listening to politicians saying, what are we going to cut? But what they've often done is have a bogus exercise in consultation about which cuts should be prioritised or which services should be saved. And actually, they never offer the option of saying that there should be no cuts and what are we going to do in order to generate the funds to avoid any setbacks on jobs or wage levels for workforces or the service to the local population. They never offer that as an option in those so-called consultation exercises. Instead, it's a case of which school do you want shut down, your local one or one in another neighbourhood that of course sets people at each other's throats, which is a conscious intention. Or should we cut the workforce or should we cut the local services to the public? A conscious attempt to divide and conquer, to distract people from the real problem, which is the lack of funding from central government and from the local government financial fundraising system, the taxation system. And that's where the Scottish Socialist Party has been entirely different. Now, I don't want to go over everything that we've said on this subject. I'll focus in a minute on our alternative to the council tax, but let me make the general point that what we've argued for in place of cuts budgets is defiance of the cuts, starting at Holyrood and then also at local government level, and that we've argued that they should set as an absolute minimum kind of standstill budgets with no cuts, let alone the preference of actually budgets which expand services, which is drastically needed, and which takes back on some of the workers that have been shed and reduce the workload and the stress loads within the workforce. But even if it wasn't as reforming and progressive as that, as an absolute minimum, we've argued that councils should set no cuts budgets. And then, of course, they would face the inevitable position of not having enough funds to balance the books. And what we've argued is that they should square up to that and demand back some of the billions in the case of Scotland, or at least tens of millions in each local government, or hundreds of millions in bigger ones in councils, to demand back the stolen billions, the stolen millions that have been robbed by central government at Westminster level or in turn at Holyrood, to win back those funds in order to at least hold on to what we've got as a first defensive action before going forward with spending plans that could build houses and so on. Because we live in a society where there's a drastic need for advances, not retreat. We need job creation. We need to provide for the fact that there's 157,000 families, not individuals, families, on the housing waiting list in Scotland currently. There's people who would jump at the chance of either being trained or reskilled in the building trade to build such houses and to make them of high environmental standards as well, to cut down fuel poverty and so on. And yet, councils instead are shedding their housing stock, or have done over a number of years, and not directly dealing with them through quangos like the Glasgow Housing Association, for instance. Or in the case of other services, they're cutting back on school provision. Class sizes are increasing after a period where they began to fall a little bit. And you get the position where quite often what they do is that instead of increasing the council tax, which is unpopular, then councils have increased charges for services, so that it costs more to hire a room for a local community group, and therefore quite often prices them out of participation or real local democracy. Or it costs more for Meals on Wheels services, or it costs more for school meals. One, and only one example I'll give concretely, is that in the case of Argyll and Bute, then the school meal prices rocketed by the equivalent of £200 a year for a family with 2 children during the years 2007 to 2013, because it went up from £1.50 to £2.10. Now, 60p a day might at first not seem that much, but for families that are scraping to survive, now it's a huge hit on their family income. And of course, the low paid in particular, the in-work poor so-called, are the ones who quite often are the worst hit by that kind of increased service charge as an option instead of sometimes council tax increases. But going on from the idea that the councils should stand up on their hind legs and defy the Tories, and that the Scottish Government should do likewise, and that they should mobilise the council workforces and communities to demand back the billions that have been stolen of Scotland, the hundreds of millions of places like Glasgow, by public cutting of fund, by austerity, if you want to call it that. And alongside of that, we also say that the current system of taxation for local government is entirely unacceptable on several counts. One is the fact that it's regressive, it's unfair, it's the opposite to a progressive tax, hits the lowest income and the middle income families and individuals hardest, and the very richest least. And also on top of that, it's not up to the job description of raising the funds for adequate local jobs and services. It's the child of the struggle against its predecessor, the poll tax. Previously there was a system, which I don't intend to go into the history of, but a system called rates. And the rating system was based on property values. And under the old rate system, one merit it had, to be fair, was that the differential between the highest rates for a household and the lowest was 14 to 1. However, Maggie Thatcher and her Tory government took a look at the opposition benches of the Labour Party at the time, led by the right wing that were dubbed New Labour, and decided they were useless. They wouldn't put up a fight. So as part of her general crusade against the working class and to redistribute wealth upwards, to defy gravity through economics, and to have a stream of wealth upwards instead of a trickle-down theory that she professed, which is a falsehood, then she introduced the poll tax. And the difference was that the poll tax had no differential. It was a flat rate. It was actually a flat rate per local authority, which actually meant it was even worse in some respects than a flat rate. Because what it meant was that in the richer boroughs, some of the rural areas and the very rich, wealthy shires of Scotland, and, well, Scotland was the guinea pig for it for a year before England had the pleasure, and some of the richest areas had lower levels of poll tax per head than the poorest districts such as Dundee and Glasgow. So it was actually the case that the Duke might pay less in absolute terms than the dust bin collector, to use a phrase of that time. It was the case, certainly, that in terms of their relative incomes, it was a drastically regressive tax which was hammering the working class and the middle class even, compared to the way the rich got off scot-free virtually in terms of the percentage of their income. There was a revolt against it, which I haven't got the time to describe, starting in Scotland. And those of us who founded the SSP, or some of us that founded the SSP, were instrumental in leading that revolt against the poll tax in the late 80s. And then it was abolished under that revolt, a revolt that included 18 million people across Britain pledging and refusing to pay the poll tax. So hated was that measure of flat rate taxation on the population. And when it was abolished under the Tories, and Thatcher's continuation as Prime Minister was also abolished in the process, she stood down under the revolt of the poll tax. When it was abolished, they rushed in its replacement in the form of the council tax. Now, it's not as bad as the poll tax, but it's still the son of. It's still a system which is regressive. It's still a system, and I won't bury you with figures, but it's still a system where, for instance, the maximum differential between the highest council tax bill and the lowest, up until currently, this year at least, is 3 to 1. Not the 14 to 1 of the rate system of old, not the 1 to 1 of the poll tax either, but 3 to 1. And for instance, that's meant an utterly regressive system which is added to inequality as inequality balloons in a more general sense. It's not the cause of the most fundamental redistribution of wealth to the rich from the rest of us, but it adds to it. It contributes to it in its own right. The council tax, for example, claims 5.2% of the income of the poorest fifth, the poorest 20% of the population in Scotland. Those figures are from 2 years ago. So 5.2% of the income of the poorest fifth. Only 1.7% of the income of the richest fifth of the population. So you can see things are upside down in that respect. Instead of the rich paying more as a proportion of their income, they pay, well, in that case, a third less as a percentage of their income than the poorest fifth or 20% of the population. To put it another way, quite often there's been pensioners paying up to a quarter of their income on council tax bills. A horrendous imposition on people with little enough to begin with. The Citizens Advice Bureau in Scotland also reported that back in 2005, nearly a quarter, nearly 25% of the debt cases that they were dealing with, helping individuals on, involved council tax debts. That rocketed to 33% just 4 years later. So that's an indication that things are bad and they're getting worse. in terms of the regressive impact of that council tax and the debts. And by the way, Scots law means that they can pursue council tax debts and poll tax debts for up to 21 years, which means that the debt gets worse for those unable to pay it. And that's an imposition on people already struggling to cope with inflation compared to wage cuts or benefit cuts and so on. Now, the response to that and the regressive, backward and hated nature of the council tax, the response from each of the political parties is something we should never lose sight of. When the Scottish Socialist Party was founded in 1998, then we immediately declared, it wasn't originally 16 points, but that's how it turned out to be, a rather awkward figure, but a 16-point programme that was our founding policies, a working policy manifesto to be added to and discussed as we built up the party. One of those 16, which shows there was a priority, was for abolition of the council tax and its replacement with a progressive tax based on ability to pay, based on income. We then developed that with the assistance of economists at the University of Paisley, as it was then, who gave us economic models and such like in terms of statistics and information on incomes in the country. And we worked out a system that became known, or that we labelled, the Scottish service tax. Now, to bring that bang up to date, what it amounts to is a system whereby you would tax people for local services, and this is purely for local government. It's got nothing to do with general income tax on your wages. But a tax on income, on wages or benefits, although we'll come back to that, or whatever form of income you had, a tax on that rising through various tax bands as your income got bigger. And first of all, the first £10,000, although I would advocate should be increased to 11 to be in tune with local, with wages, pay-as-you-earn tax system. But anyway, stick to how it is at the minute. That the first 10,000 of income would be zero-rated Scottish service tax. So anybody on such a low income, and there are such people, wouldn't pay a penny towards the local services through the councils. Then the next 20,000 of an income, from 10,000 up to 30,000, we've proposed should have a 4.5% tax rate for the Scottish service tax. And between 30,000 and 40, a 15% rate on just that bit of the income, I mean. Between 40 and 50,000 pounds, that 10,000, if you're on 50, that upper 10,000 would be taxed at 15%, and so on, including 21% on the income between 50,000 and 90, and then 23% tax rate on the income above 90,000. So, as with any tax system, any income tax system, it's not that your entire income would be taxed at that rate, but those bands of income would be, if that makes sense to you. As one example, and perhaps this kind of contrasts the impact it has on different sections of society and different income brackets. Somebody on £14,000 of an income, again not uncommon, part-time workers and sometimes full-time workers actually, then they would be excluded for the first 10,000 of their income. The other 4,000 would be taxed at 4.5%. The annual Scottish service tax levied on that individual would be £180. Take a contrast, somebody on £100,000, they're going through all the calculations, with the different tax bands combined, would pay £14,900. A huge differential between those on a very low income and those on certainly in the top 3 or 4% of the population on £100,000, because it's only 5% of the population roughly that are above £80,000 of an income. And what that highlights straight away is that our proposal is progressive, it's redistributive in a very modest fashion at least. It would redistribute wealth at a localised level from the rich to the rest of us. It would raise money for local jobs and services, but primarily the tax burden would fall on the shoulders of the rich minority. And we've also calculated, those figures are from last year, we've also calculated that based on that system and based on the income brackets in Scotland, then the total impact would be that at least 77% of households would pay less in their bills than they do currently on the council tax. And here's the punchline really, that based on that system, instead of £2 billion being raised through the council tax last year, which was the figure, then the Scottish service tax, our proposal, would have raised 4.1 billion. And that's precisely because the growth of inequality has involved a collapse in the real incomes of a big slice of the working class and the middle income working class as well. But it's also involved a phenomenal growth, explosion of wealth for the very rich minority, which means in turn a progressive, even local tax system such as that would have a huge impact on the tax payable, as I've illustrated with 100,000 income paying nearly 15,000 under our scheme. That would have a huge impact on the amount of money raised from the very rich, and in total therefore, within round figures, would have last year doubled the income for local jobs and services, at least in the sense of the income from local taxation. Not overall, because the government pays most of it in funding, but in the part that comes from local taxation. Now that is a win-win proposal. It means that the vast majority of the population are better off directly in their pockets in terms of paying less than they do under the council tax. It means Scotland's local government, all 32 of them, could be entirely protected from cuts. Because when you look at it, these various figures are mentioned at the start, and the reason I bored you stiff with statistics at the start is to show the practical realities of the impact of the Scottish service tax. Because if there's been £3 billion worth of cuts, roughly, in local government in the last 7 years, then already, instead of £3 billion cuts, there would be a £2 billion increase in income from councils, last year alone, in the 1 year, under our proposal. So you could not just stand still, you could begin to reverse some of the cuts immediately if that measure was implemented at a Scottish level. And I must stress, because this is where there's been some debate in the past when there's a more broadly debated issue in the Parliament, for example, we put this forward as a bill, as proposals in the Parliament, and was voted down by the Labour and Lib Dem coalition. And we should remember that because just about exactly a year ago, Scottish Labour declared they were going to abolish the unfair council tax. Now that has a certain ring of familiarity about it as a phrase, because something we've been banging on about for about 17 years before that, on the streets, in the Parliament, in the unions, council unions and so on. And Labour opposed it to the hilt and argued in defence of the council tax. And in fact, as an aside, the much praised Labour manifesto for the recent British general election, the only thing I can trace about local government finance in that is that they promise a review of the council tax to make it fair and to look at other options such as a land value tax. There is no promise whatsoever to remove the council tax from existence and to replace it with a progressive tax based on income and therefore an ability to pay. That's the contrast even between Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto and that of the Scottish Socialist Party since 1998 actually. So we can be proud of the foresight and the persistence and the consistency we've had on that subject. Which brings me then to the subject of the current government in Scotland, the SNP, very briefly. Because the SNP, I think it was in 2007, but don't kill me if that's the wrong general election date, after we had popularised the demand to abolish the council tax and to replace it with an income-based replacement, the Scottish service tax, the SNP, in one of those election manifestos, declared for scrapping the council tax and instead they would bring in an income tax. Now there was a difference compared to our proposal, which I'll just say as an aside. They put forward a flat rate tax of, I think it was 3% from memory. In other words, regardless of your income, you'd be levied a 3% of that income for local services, for council services. That's not as good as our proposal, because our one redistributes wealth, whereas a 3% flat rate tax would actually hit the low and middle income bracket harder than the richer, and it would still be regressive. Any flat rate tax is. But nevertheless, the idea of having an income-based tax rather than the dog's dinner, which is totally regressive of the council tax, was seen as a step forward and gained the SNP a huge vote. But what did they do with that mandate? Rather than proceed to introduce a bill with the powers they had, first as a minority government and then as a majority one, they have never, ever introduced a bill to abolish the council tax. And in fact, I think again it was last year, same time as Labour's sudden verbal conversion, the SNP declared they would keep the council tax but make it fair by increasing the amounts that would have to be paid by the top 4 bands. You know how you've got band A houses, band B up to band H. Well, bands, is it E to H? I've lost the alphabet, I think it is. The top 4 would have to pay a bit more. But I mean, it's only tickling the bellies of the rich, frankly, the measures that they have brought in, and doesn't really fundamentally redistribute the source of income for local government, or the source of burden on the part of the population. And we have persisted with this argument, and we've also pointed out that as well as creating extra funds for services, it could expand jobs. And we've linked it with the demand that the way it would be collected would be centrally. We're against the idea that, for instance, some have put forward, including the Lib Dems, when they bother putting anything forward on the subject, but they've at least got a passive paper policy of a local income tax. Now, sometimes even our own members loosely and carelessly combine the two expressions. It's a totally different concept. A local income tax based in each of the 32 local council authority areas would, in my view, be regressive. Because what it would mean is a repeat of some of the problems of the poll tax, in that the poorest boroughs would need more of an income precisely because there was more demand for services of a lower income based population, plus the income base would be lower, and therefore the percentage tax that would have to be levied to get the same amount of income would be higher than a rich area. To put it concretely, somewhere like East Renfrewshire or East Dumbarton could afford a lower level of local income tax than Glasgow, and in fact already have lower levels of council tax than Glasgow, which would be in danger of turning those areas into kind of mini versions of tax havens in the suburbs of the more impoverished conurbations or cities. Or to put it another way, they could commute to all the big services in Glasgow, whether it be the concert hall or the various venues and so on, but not have to pay their share of the contribution to the upkeep of those public services by paying a lower rate of local income tax in those neighbouring, richer local authorities. So the proposal of the SSP is not a local service tax or local income tax in the sense of the local authorities. It's a Scottish service tax. It's nationwide. It's one where somebody on 15,000 a year in the Highlands would pay the same amount as somebody in the Borders or in Glasgow if they had the same income. It's a system where it would be collected centrally and then distributed according to need by some kind of forum involving local authorities, local authority union representatives, the Scottish Government and service users. I mean, we've not put forward an exact blueprint of the detail of the forum, but some kind of body which would involve local authorities, workers in local authorities, and vitally community representatives who would be relying upon the services provided at local authority level. And through that system, or some formula worked out between that, a democratic allocation of funding from a centrally collected service tax distributed to the local authorities according to their greatest need. So that, in other words, the richer boroughs might not need as much, as the poorer ones in terms of income brackets, etc. It's a system that would protect Scotland from austerity, at least in terms of local government. It removes the excuse for cuts and strips away the feeble whines of politicians at council and Scottish Government level that there is no alternative. There is an alternative, and whilst we therefore advocate the idea of defiance budgets, of no cuts budgets, budgets that refuse to pass on the cuts from the Westminster Tories at Scottish and local government level, and whilst we use that not as a folded arm exercise, but as a means to act as a platform to mobilise people to demand back the stolen billions and the stolen tens of millions to fund the services and jobs required, we also simultaneously argue that the Scottish Government should rush through emergency legislation, which is within their powers if the political will is there, to scrap the council tax and introduce the Scottish service tax. Now, of course, we could debate the details of it. We could debate, for example, the exact percentages and the exact tax bands. That's not a problem. We're not fixated about those exact figures. But we've devised a fully costed alternative based on those calculations and those figures that proves the point. You could double your money in terms of local taxation for local government at a stroke if the political will was there. And I'll conclude by saying that even at a level of local government, even at that localised level, let alone our demands for a wealth tax on the rich or for public ownership of the centres of economic production, let alone all of that, the bigger picture politics of the SSP, that one measure is justification for the existence of the Scottish Socialist Party and is a reminder of the need for an organised socialist party like us, because all those other parties put to the test have failed, either failed in total by standing on the side of a regressive tax or failed to implement their empty promises something like 10 years later. So that's a reminder that the working class population and the middle income brackets would be better off under the measures of a Scottish Socialist Party government, and a reminder of why we have to strive towards that and build support for our own policies on the road to achieving that.
Okay, Richie, thanks very much. It's comprehensive as usual.